Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to my talk. Now, before I get going, it felt quite warm to me in here, so I've opened. There's a secret door. I don't know where it goes, but it's a secret door, but it is making that wobble a bit. Is that distracting or annoying? Is that all the heat, really? So, I'll be speaking with you about the science that underpins positive behaviour support. So we'll talk a bit about human behaviour, why we do the things that we do, and how we can use that information, that science, to address challenging behaviour by adding to people's repertoires, okay, by increasing their skill sets. Can you hear me at the back? Okay, good. Okay, so 10 core components to positive behaviour support. I'll be looking at this one today. This is the one I'll be focusing on. So applied behaviour analysis, which uses behaviour change strategies that came out of the scientific study of learning and behaviour. Decades of research on trying to uncover all the principles that govern our behaviour. An important point to make is that this talk, it is very much about the science, behaviour analysis, science of human behaviour that applies to all humans. So we'll be talking about challenging behaviour in people with learning disability and autism, but science applies to everyone. I'm not worried about people waiting for the end for questions, so if you have anything you want to ask, just ask. Okay, so why do we do what we do? I think it's one of the big questions that's up there with, cosmology and quantum mechanics. Why do we do what we do? Well, you'll all be familiar with the idea of nature and nurture. Not versus, because it's often spoke about in that way, but nature and nurture. So genetics and learning history. Okay. This talk is about the latter, nurture. Because whilst genetics certainly play a part, we don't have a technology yet where we can directly tweak people's genes after they're born, in case there are any geneticists here, after they're born, and change their behaviour. So we'll be talking about the learning history part, the behavioural part. So under that heading of nurture, you've got learning history. Okay, all of our experiences throughout our lifetime, and what I'll come on to a bit later is current context, because to understand any act, any behaviour, you have to understand the context in which it occurs. Today is an interesting context. I've presented in pubs, cinemas, lots of different places, but never attend. It's an experience. So think of learning history as a toolbox, okay? Something that we're adding to and sometimes taking out of throughout the lifespan. So it really is a case of from the cradle to the grave. And into that go all of the behaviours, all of the skills we need to get on in life, to get the things we want. So from the mundane stuff, like asking for a cup of coffee, having a shower, to the more sophisticated skills like initiating a discussion, forming a relationship with someone, driving a car, getting a job. Everything goes in there. Now, to answer that question that I flipped through, what determines what goes into the toolbox, we need to start getting into that science, that applied behaviour analysis. And this, you have to, consequential causality, this is the only bit of jargon in the whole talk, and you have to indulge me because I'm a big sci-fi fan and this reminds me of Doctor Who. That's all I can say. It reminds me of Doctor Who. So and this is Skinner. So if you ask any behaviour analyst, if you say who's the daddy, they will say Skinner. He's the father. He's the father of modern behaviourism. Okay. So what Skinner said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the outcome of a behaviour, okay, will determine whether or not it becomes part of our repertoire. Okay, so if we display a behaviour and it leads to some kind of positive outcome, more likely to go into that toolbox. Okay, if it doesn't get us what we want, or if it leads to something unpleasant, then it's less likely to become part of our repertoire. Okay? Consequential causality. So we learn things in different ways, and one of the ways is through direct experience. Okay? So this is just an example from that probably all of us can relate to. It's something I guess we experience. Maybe not. Maybe the details are a little bit different. But here you've got a 2-year-old who walks into the kitchen, hears this interesting hissing sound from the top of the cooker, puts their hand up, burns their hand. Okay, that behaviour is not likely to go into the toolbox. A different behaviour will, and it will be the behaviour of walking by or doing something different. Okay, so that's an example of learning by direct experience. But we also learn by forming rules. So this applies to those more complex behaviours as well, like getting a job. So this scenario, the lady in blue is going for a job, and someone says to her, so this is the rule part, if you do a bit of research on the common questions that get asked at interviews, you've got a better chance of getting a job. So she goes away and does her research, goes onto Google, and she finds out that there are lots of common questions that get asked. And it so happens one of them actually is, tell me about a conflict situation that you had with a colleague and how did you resolve it. That actually is quite a common question. So she does her research, does a really good interview and gets the job. Okay? Because of that rule, do research, get a good outcome, is more likely to be part of her behavioural repertoire. Okay? The other way we learn is by seeing people either behave in a way that gets them the things they want, or behave in ways that lead to something unpleasant. Okay? So vicarious learning as well. Now, I will kind of move this in and out of the field of challenging behaviour as we go. Consequential causality, learning by outcomes or consequences, also applies to challenging behaviour, okay, which is where we'll be going with this talk in a little while. So here's a real life example. This is someone that I worked with years ago. We'll call her Maria. That's not her name. So Maria was someone who had a learning disability and autism, and she couldn't speak. And what people had found was if they asked her to wash up, her response was usually to hit herself really hard. And the staff, because they didn't want her to hurt herself, would say, that's okay, I'll do it. And because that was a positive outcome for her, so consequential causality, this was a behaviour that went into that toolbox. Okay? So a bit of a summary on the first part of that, on the learning history part. A behaviour becomes part of our repertoire if it gets us the things we want. So any questions on that so far? Okay, good. So that leads to another question. What is it that makes us pull a behaviour out of that toolbox and use it in a given situation? And again, this is something that it applies to all human behaviour. Okay, so I said earlier, you have to understand context if you are to understand behaviour. Behaviour doesn't occur in a vacuum. It always occurs for a reason. To get to that, we have to understand the context. So I thought I had some special effects thing going on there for a minute. Here we go. So current context, we can break that down into 4 different categories of context. So there's the social context, like this, yeah, to do with the person and other people around them and what's going on there. Yeah? There's the activity-related context. So what is it that the person is doing at that moment? Biological context, what's going on with them biologically, and finally the physical context, and that's inanimate objects. It can be noise, it can be temperature, and so on. Okay. So What I'm not doing here is giving a definitive list of all of the different types of antecedents, triggers for challenging behaviour that would fall under these categories, because you could go on endlessly. You could put criticism in there or various other things. This is just to give a sense of some of the common contexts that are associated with challenging behaviour, okay? And then we'll talk a little bit about what we can do about that. So communication difficulties are widely acknowledged as a risk factor for challenging behaviour. Doesn't guarantee it, that's important, doesn't guarantee it, but it is a risk factor. So the more profound or severe someone's learning disability, the greater the likelihood they'll engage in challenging behaviour. Why is that?
Frustration. Sorry.
Go on.
Frustration.
Frustration, yeah.
They don't have other means to meet their needs.
Indeed, yeah, exactly. So, now, I've deliberately put this here, the absence of a specialised system, because this is crucial when we're talking about context for behaviour, because communication difficulties are an issue and are more likely to lead to challenging behaviour in the absence of some kind of system for addressing it, okay? So, I'm going to illustrate this with a visual example, okay? I wear glasses, yeah? If I take these off, I now will not be able to get home at the end of the day. Driving my car would be dangerous for everyone, okay? I would need help to get back. So I put them on and I no longer have an issue. And that's a really key thing to remember when we're talking about challenging behaviour. It's only an issue if there isn't something else there, another skill, as we'll be talking about later, that addresses it. Activity can be anything. This is a guy having a bad time at work. Lack of choice, lack of predictability, very much sort of grouped together under the heading of control. So if people don't have ways of exerting meaningful control over their environments, then they're far more likely to find that what will happen is they will find some way of getting that control, some way of making things happen. The biological context. Now, what we know, and this has been demonstrated experimentally in research, is that pain, fatigue, biological factors can have a direct influence on challenging behaviour. Okay? And it's one of the first things people in my field, behaviour analysts, are taught to look for if they get a referral. Have we ruled out physical factors? And I can't remember who it was, but there was some research recently on challenging behaviour in people with learning disabilities, and they found that it was between 40 and 50% of people who were engaging in challenging behaviour had an undiagnosed or untreated physical health problem. Think about that for a minute. How do we feel, if we're under the weather? We're a bit more likely to snap, maybe? And lastly, the physical environment. So noisy, crowded places, restricted access. Yeah, and remember, because we moved on a few slides, we're talking about contexts that kind of produce challenging behaviour. So restricted access to food and objects. Many times over the year, actually I was thinking of someone on the way here who he tried to drink bleach once, very dangerous behaviour, and as a result, as an emergency measure, the staff locked the door, which is sensible, it makes sense. His behaviours then in the weeks that followed were all about getting access to that kitchen. Okay, so that's how the environment can impact directly on behaviour. So what the staff did was just remove the bleach and open the kitchen, and problem solved. Okay, so just to bring that back to Maria, our example from earlier there, what would you guys say is the context that is active here in influencing her behaviour? So she's asked to wash up, she hits, people take that request away.
Ask her just to clean up just her own rather than everyone.
That's a strategy that might well work. What context here
Activity.
appears to be activity?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Okay.
Social.
Okay. a non-preferred activity. I would agree with that. But this is where, because the way, often when we talk about things like this, and I'm always very conscious of it when we talk about behaviours that challenge, it makes it all seem so neat and simple. It's not. It's not. If you think of human existence, human behaviour, there are so many things going on, so many stimuli at any moment. It's not as straightforward as I'm not trying to make it seem more simple than it is. So what if I give you a bit more information about Maria? And this is, again, this is a real life person. So it's actually the case that there are times when Maria's far more likely to self-injure if she is asked to wash up, and it's almost exclusively during the time of her period. Okay. Now, if you take that into account, is it still just activity that's playing a part? Biological, exactly, and that's a really important thing to remember when we're trying to understand why people engage in challenging behaviour. Sometimes these contexts have to combine to produce behaviour, and that's why you get this variability. I don't know if you guys are working in the field, or parents, or you're close to people who sometimes engage in challenging behaviour, but have any of you had the experience where you do something, you're supporting someone on a Monday in a very particular way, and everything goes fine? Exactly the same support the next day, and there's an incident. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's because of this. Okay, and what we have to become are pretty good detectives at trying to get to the bottom of these things. Okay, so a summary, and just to backtrack a little bit to some of the to what I started with there: nature, nurture. So genetic endowment, putting that aside for a minute, looking just at the nurture side here. So what the science has told us, I needed my little science slide there, my little microscope, but never mind. What the science tells us is that over time we learn what behaviours work for us in a given context. And it's not that we consciously do that. So you imagine the context of driving your car, and you're getting close to the lights, and the lights change to red. You hit the brake, yeah? You don't think to yourself, okay, the lights have changed to red, I need to take my foot off the accelerator. You do it automatically. Walking into a library, you lower your voice, yeah? The context is telling you what to do, but we do it automatically. Any questions before we move on to the next bit? Okay, so this is something I think quite a few of you will be familiar with. I've talked a lot about how behaviour how repertoires are acquired because of the outcomes, the consequences, what they lead to for the person. Okay, so when we talk about this, we usually refer to it as the function of someone's behaviour. It's just another way of saying, what does it get the person, what does it enable them to avoid. Okay? Hands up if you're familiar with this. I just want to get a sense of how to pitch this. Okay, brilliant. So I won't spend ages on it, but do ask questions. Okay. So a behaviour stays part of someone's repertoire because it leads to some kind of sensory consequence that works for them. Okay. So a non-challenging behaviour example of a sensory behaviour is you're bitten by a mosquito. Your behaviour is you scratch it and it feels better. Yeah. No one else delivered that outcome for you. Okay. You did it yourself. That's important because the other functions are about other people doing things, delivering it. Socially mediated reward. Okay. Escape. This is behaviours that result in something unpleasant being taken away. So earlier we talked about Maria with the washing up example. Attention, as the name suggests. I sometimes prefer to call this social. What do I call it? Social contact. Because I think attention can be a little bit of a dirty word almost. It's attention. It's about gaining attention, as if that's wrong in some way. Whenever we pick the phone up and ring someone for a chat, the function of our behaviour is attention. Yeah? Has anyone ever been to a really boring party? Hands up, hands up. What did you do? What did you do?
I got drunk.
Which is a form of escape. What else did you do? Yeah, leave. Oh, I have to get up early. I have to walk the dog. We come up with excuses. Yeah, the function's the same as someone who self-injures to get away from that party. It's just we've learned a different way of doing it. Yeah, the function's always legitimate. It's just the way people have learned to get that. That's where maybe they need a bit of help. Okay, so all of that leads us to the thing that I mentioned at the start, using all of this science, using all of this knowledge to address challenging behaviour by teaching people things. So all of what we know from learning theory, all we know about how outcomes of behaviour determine whether or not they're going to become part of our repertoires. So again, this is something I think quite a few of you will be familiar with. So best practice says if we're going to come up with some kind of a behaviour support program for someone who engages in challenging behaviour, it should be informed by a functional behaviour assessment. And a functional behaviour assessment tries to identify all the things we were talking about before. The contexts, which we can think of as unhelpful contexts, and the functions, the outcomes. And what the science tells us is, if we come up with strategies that are based on an understanding of function, they're twice as likely to be successful than those that aren't. So what we tend to do, if we're doing it properly, is do our functional behaviour assessment, come up with strategies that are based on those findings, and a behaviour support program should have proactive strategies and reactive strategies. Proactive strategies, this is what you're doing when the person is not displaying challenging behaviour. Okay, that's before it occurs. That's the preventative element of it. Reactive strategies are what you do after. And what you always... Are there any commissioners in the room? Not one, really? Okay. Well, I was about to say, if you're a commissioner and you go into services and all you see are reactive strategies, that's a red flag. Because all that does is tend to perpetuate a cycle of we only respond when there's challenging behaviour. Yeah, and remember the outcomes. If all you're doing is giving people that positive response when challenging behaviour occurs, what will you see? More challenging behaviour. So we can further divide behaviour support. I'm going to come over there for a bit just to change the view. There we are. You can further subdivide behaviour support strategies into strategies that carers are responsible for delivering, okay, and strategies that are about teaching the person new skills, which I'll be getting onto. So carer-directed strategies, and carers can be family members, paid staff. It's what they tend to comprise of are strategies for avoiding the kind of context we were discussing. So if someone, let's use the example of Maria from earlier, you simply wouldn't ask her to do the washing up. That would be a very obvious carer-directed strategies. Okay, she tends to get a bit upset if you ask her to wash up. She tends to hit herself. Let's just not ask her, okay? If it's a good behaviour support program, it will have some strategies that are about improving quality of life as well, because none of the science matters if you've not got that. And finally, it's got strategies that are about keeping people safe, and that goes more to those sort of the more narrowly focused reactive strategies. Okay, what do we do if an incident occurs? How can we bring it to a close as quickly and as safely as possible using the least restrictive methods? Carer-directed strategies. Teaching the person new skills. Generally, we could have general skills on there as well, I guess, but generally we're looking at teaching people alternatives to challenging behaviour, and I'll run through a few examples of that in a minute, or coping skills. Now, the difference between the two would be, let's give you a real life example. Okay, so I was working with someone who could engage in quite severe physical aggression. He put a few people into hospital, and one of the warning signs of that was if you wore glasses, he would grab them. He would take them off you. So I was sitting with him and his support worker. This guy who didn't speak, had a learning disability, and because I wasn't including him enough, he made a grab for my glasses. So I quickly responded because I knew what was coming next. But when we started teaching him a new skill, we taught him to do that instead, as a way of getting that attention without having to grab the glasses. Okay, I know James, so he doesn't mind if I poke. Coping skills, that's more about teaching tolerance. Okay, so another example would be someone I worked with who couldn't tolerate the sound of babies crying. And it was a very high-risk behaviour because if he heard a baby crying in the community, he would run towards it to hit it. That was his way of trying to make it stop. So we had to use a desensitisation program, gradually get him used to the sound of babies crying, using recording, using TV, before we could actually safely be in the community with him. So it wasn't actually teaching him an alternative skill as such, it was more about teaching him just not to get upset when the baby cried. So to illustrate the different focus of carer-directed strategies versus strategies that are about teaching a new skill, here's an example of an incident that a direct care support worker recorded after the event. So many of you will be familiar with this type of recording. It's called an ABC form. It talks about what happened before the incident, what the behaviour was, and what happened after. And often by analysing that's the outcome, we can find out what the function is. So Julie was a lady who had really bad psoriasis that kind of flares up and goes away. She loved drama, but like our earlier example, psoriasis plus a noisy, busy drama class equaled screaming, and the staff knew that was the time to leave, and then she would relax. So an example of a carer-directed strategy here was, and that's what people did, don't go when her psoriasis flares up. Okay? An example of a strategy that involved teaching Julie an alternative was, and this was years ago, we didn't have the high-tech stuff, so it was handing a carer a red card that said, I need a break. Yeah? They left the room. It has the same function as screaming, but didn't involve her hurting herself. Now, can anyone think of what's the limitation of that strategy?
Stops her from accessing drama.
Stops her accessing drama, yeah. What if it's not busy? You know, she would have been okay, yeah? So just hold on to that thought for a minute. I'm not saying carer-directed strategies, there's anything wrong with them. We have to have them, but just to be aware of some of the limitations. So, if you think, coming back to Julie, dear, Julie was someone who she actually could speak, but she didn't use language in a very functional way. It was echolaic, so she'd sort of repeat what other people said. And she had a severe learning disability. And if you think about that, yeah, and this was what we did, and it was successful. We taught her to hand someone a card. She would do that instead of screaming. But if you think about it, Julie wasn't someone. We couldn't say to her, okay, if you feel that you need to leave the drama class, hand us a red card. Couldn't do that. She didn't have the level of cognitive functioning that would enable her to respond to that fairly complex stuff, okay? Fairly complex sentence. So what we had to do was use all of the science that we talked about earlier. So how do we teach people alternatives to challenging behaviour? The first thing we have to do is identify the function of the behaviour. Okay? What is it achieving? Now, in Julie's case, we knew it was about getting out of that noisy, busy place. Okay? The next thing we did was look at selecting the right alternative skill. Now, I'm not going to go into this in great depth, but what you have to do, you have to figure out what it is that the person's likely to be capable of doing. Doesn't mean you can't teach people new things, but for example, If you have someone who has never spoken before, teaching them an alternative to challenging behaviour that involves them speaking is probably not going to be your first option, because we can teach adults to speak, but it can take a lot longer. Okay, teaching someone who has some kind of physical health problem that prevents them from holding things, it wouldn't work for handing a car because of the physical dexterity that's required. We might need to teach them to press a button. So it has to be something that they're physically likely to be able to do. Okay, and here this is just to prompt me really to remember a few different examples. We've got things that are that was someone who used to touch people inappropriately, and as a way of getting a response from them, so we taught him to shake hands instead. Okay? This is a Big Mac switch, that is the name, and you pre-record a message on it, so it could be, can I have some help please, and you teach the person to press it as a way of getting that response. There's touch chat, there are apps for iPhones now, so what's been brilliant in recent years is that we've got a lot of technology now that can help people communicate their needs in a different way, in a way that isn't stigmatizing like the old sort of velcros on a sort of laminated board and so on. Teach it. Okay, so this is where a level of technical knowledge is required. We tend to use something called prompt fading in behaviour analysis as a way of teaching people things. So if to use I'll go back to the example of the guy we taught to shake hands. He was someone who would touch women's breasts, he would lift their skirt up, he was doing some behaviours that were frightening for other people, but had caused him to be chucked out of 2 houses basically. So he had a pretty bad time with it. People understandably thought it was sexually motivated, and it wasn't. We did a functional behaviour assessment, and it was just a very successful way of getting a response. As you might imagine, people are going to respond to this. So, but he wasn't someone who would shake hands, and you couldn't say to him, shake hands. It just wasn't something in his repertoire. So prompt fading for him took the form of physically, we set it up as a role play. So we had the staff all ready to respond in a very positive way if he shook hands. And it was literally me walking alongside him as he walked into his house and physically guiding him to shake hands with someone. Full physical prompt first off. Then gradually over time fading that to just moving his hand towards the other person's hand, touching his elbow, and then waiting to see if he could do it himself. Okay, it takes a while. You have to do it with all different people, all the places you need to do it. But that's how we taught him that skill, and that's pretty much the essence of skills teaching. Then you have to generalise it to all of the situations that the person might need it. So carrying on with that example, if that gentleman had been touching people inappropriately in the community, we'd have had to have trained it there as well. Turns out it wasn't. It was actually only just in his house. And the nice end to that story is that after 2 weeks there was a 70% reduction in inappropriate touching. Within 3 months, 0. And I went round to visit, and he walked into the room and there were about 6 people there, and he went round and shook everyone's hand really quickly. So it was a very successful behaviour. Okay, because I've talked about her a lot, I thought I'd talk about what we did with Julie. She was someone who, as we've talked about already, at times she was okay with doing the washing up, but not always. So we wanted her to be able to make that choice. So it was literally using that same prompt fading procedure. We taught her how to press a button instead of hitting herself. And it really was, you have to be quite quick with this. It was a case of, the staff member would say, we're all set up for this. Was it Julie? No, Maria, sorry. Maria, would you like to help with the washing up? And before she could self-injure, it was physically prompting her to press that button. Staff member would say, okay, I'll do it. Okay, we're delivering the outcome because we want this to become part of her repertoire. That took actually a little bit longer. That took about 6 months, and it wasn't taught very well, but 6 months versus 20 years of engaging in that behaviour, and she was a 40-year-old lady. So if anyone ever says, oh, someone's too old to learn, absolutely not. Absolutely not supported by the science.
Nick, sorry. I'm just wondering, did you also make, if Maria did get us out, did you also remove the demand then as well, or would you just make a contingent on the...
Well, what we did, we tried to do a little bit. That's a good question. So, what I've described is a way of teaching that proactively, getting in quickly before the behaviour occurs. You can, again, if you get your timing right, teach things reactively and shape a behaviour as it's happening. So, if the hand started to come up, we would redirect it to the button, and we were sensible about it. We knew that it was more likely to occur during the time of a period, so we were a little bit careful there. The carer-directed strategies obviously were helping her not to be in so much pain, so there's always a place for that as well. I've forgotten your question, Dave. Could you ask me again? I'm sorry.
Did you also remove the demand if Maria did get herself, or was it just removing the demand?
Yes. Okay, we would. So if she was too quick for us, and it didn't happen much, people were really kind of there at her side, we would still give it a couple of seconds before removing the demand, because we don't want to reinforce that hitting, and prompt on the button, bam. So what we were teaching Maria was hitting that, no equals the demand comes away. There is a risk with that where you can get a little bit of a behavioural chain, so we played that by ear, but didn't happen enough to become a part of the repertoire. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Did you generalise that? Sorry, did you then generalise the use of that no button for others?
Yes, we did. Yeah, we didn't need it for.
I'm sitting here wondering, well, if you're not going to make her do the washing up, and she doesn't want to do the washing up, why are you even bothering?
Yes,
so
good
if
question.
you're going to use the no teaching for other things, then
oh yeah. Well, I would argue that even if it only ever was used for that, it would be right. Given there were times when she was happy to do it, so it lets her make the choice.
Right. Oh, okay.
But yes, we did. There were other situations where, as in life, people need to make a yes/no choice, and we did use it for that. And it took. There seems to be some kind of learning that takes place when you're working with people, and then you're generalising to another situation and another, where it gets a bit quicker as you go. So it wasn't always taking, what did I say, six months was it, something like that. So yeah, just the fact that there is this behaviour. I press a button, something happens. It seems to be that can connect with enough different stimuli in the environment that it starts to happen a little bit more quickly. I'm going to open this up to some questions now, because I had some case study examples, but really I've given lots of examples as I've gone through. I've talked a lot, and I want to give you guys the chance to ask a few questions now.
But something like the bus incident now, when is it sort of safe to try and add some more complexity to it? So she doesn't like doing the dishes, and you've given her a button that says no. Can you then ask her to get the tea towels for you, or can you then ask her to do another part of the task that's kind of based on a relationship or a rapport with it?
Yeah.
So once she knows that no's safe, when is it a good time to start pushing her?
You almost answered your question. When she knows it's safe. So when that has become part of a repertoire, she no longer requires prompting to do it, then you can pretty safely. We have sort of mastery criteria. So you might say, for a couple of days in a row, every time that she's asked, she uses the button instead of self-injuring. We'll assume that behaviour's been mastered now, and then absolutely you can start trying other things. The only thing to bear in mind, like the question about generalisation, although the task is still washing up, it's still a request about a different aspect of it. So it's great if we get behaviours for free. So if you don't require extra learning on, for example, saying no to using the tea towel, but you have to be prepared to go back a little bit to some of that prompting. Some behaviour analysts sort of, allow a little bit of a delay to see if the person can do it themselves. Others maybe go back to a partial prompt just to kind of play it safe and use a sort of an errorless learning approach. Yeah. So when it's part of someone's repertoire, then we can start maybe trying a few new things.
As it took 6 months, did staff's sort of faith in the programme start to wane a little bit?
Yeah, a little bit, and I guess I won't go into tons of detail, but well, actually I will go into some detail because it's real life. This is it. We're not doing this in the context of research, and it was a service where a bunch of people left who were implementing this. So I taught them to do some of this stuff, and then half of them left. So then I had to go and reteach, and so in a sense, because a lot of them had gone, it was only, they'd gone anyway. It was only the ones who were left. They understood why things had been disrupted, but a few of them did say, okay, how long would this take? And we had to address that. But we saw, although it took 6 months to get mastery, so for that to really be part of her repertoire, it didn't take 6 months for her to acquire some aspects of that skill. Yeah. So people did see, if you do it properly, if you spend a day with someone going over and over a skill, you tend to see some evidence of that person acquiring the skill, and that seemed to be enough. Plus I was paying them lots of money. That's good. Any other questions?
Have you moved it on further? Do you want a green button as well, or is it still just a red button?
Yeah, it presses a button, Jack Daniels appears. It's
But that's making a negative choice of no rather than a positive one of yes.
Okay. Well, she was a good question. So she was someone who was, the staff actually had a few pretty good strategies in place with her picking visuals to say, I want to do this, I want to do that. And it wasn't used perfectly, as is often the case. It was a bit inconsistent. So we brought back some of that, and this is obviously, when you give examples like this, you focus on little bits. Remember, skills teaching was in the context of a behaviour support programme that addressed lots of things. So we did have choice and control from earlier. So we had strategies in there that were all about her being able to exert meaningful control, and that often involved her picking activities that she wanted. Now, she wasn't often picking the washing up, it has to be said, fair enough. But so a lot of the yes element was her taken care of by her actually saying, this is what I want to do. It was quite proactive anyway, yeah. That was good. Okay, so I'll end by hold that thought. So I'll end by talking about what I mentioned this earlier. What I really don't want to do is suggest that carer-directed strategies, there's anything wrong with them. They are often necessary. They're often what we need to do before we start teaching people new skills. And for many of the people we work with, they will always be there. So just wanted to make sure I didn't convey anything contrary to that. What are the pros of carer-directed strategies? I'm interested to get your thoughts on that. Carer-directed teaching person skills, sorry? Predictable, okay. Something for the staff team to do, yeah? And predictable for the person. Absolutely, yes. Teaching people to follow a set routine, yes. Good.
Quicker.
Who said that? Quicker, yeah. Absolutely. It's often a lot easier. I gave my 6 months example, my 2 weeks example. Sometimes you can even speed that up a little bit, but generally saying to a staff team, okay, don't go to drama when Julie's psoriasis is really bad. That's accomplished in the time it took to say that. Okay, so often, if you've got very serious behaviour, we have to have some kind of antecedent control, some kind of strategy that just removes the trigger for challenging behaviour, and that's going to be carer-directed. Yeah. What are the cons? Consistency. which can be difficult at times.
Can we do skilling?
Yeah, for the person. Exactly. We're not teaching the person anything.
Opportunity.
Sorry?
And obviously loss of opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. Because a lot of what I talked about quality of life earlier, but the reason for this, we're not all mad scientists just trying to see how many skills we can teach people. There's a purpose. It's so that people can actually get a better life. That's what that's about.
It doesn't problem solve in an imaginative way, rather.
No, absolutely. And the other thing, you can't. The example I gave of the person who was running towards babies when he heard them cry. So the carer directed strategy was 2 staff supported him, and 1 staff member was like a scout who was ahead, literally looking around to see if babies, were going to pop out from somewhere. And then if someone came along with a stroller, they'd say, okay, there's someone here, we'll go a different way. Now, that's not a foolproof plan. Someone can open the door and come out with a stroller and there's a baby there. So the advantages of teaching people new skills, teaching them how to tolerate those things, is you need to worry a bit less. You can worry a bit less about those contexts, because now you can walk along the street and if a baby cries, the person maybe puts their earphones in, whatever it is we've taught them. Maybe they've been so desensitized that it's just no longer an issue. Some of the other pros of teaching people a new skill is the obvious one. There's independence. If you teach the right skills, it can actually act as a prompt for people around them to respond in the right way and to deliver those outcomes, those reinforcing outcomes. So it was one of the case examples there. A guy I was working with would walk into a room, and if there were more than 2 or 3 people there, he would start to talk about his underwear, okay, which was socially inappropriate. And if people didn't respond, he would be physically aggressive, and it was a way of getting attention. So the strategy was, he was someone who could speak but wouldn't use his language very functionally. It was to teach him to walk into a room and say hello, because people usually say hello back. So teaching someone the right skill can be a prompt for the right type of reward, okay? And that keeps it part of their repertoire.
Also generalised to other behaviours and other situations.
Yeah. Sometimes you get it for free. You don't have to train it to the other situations, but sometimes you do. To illustrate that, I never worked with this person, but someone told me about someone with autism who was taught to swim in a particular swimming pool and was only able to swim in that pool because people didn't teach it elsewhere. It's quite an extreme illustration of context-dependent learning. So that's the summary, really. That's my take-home message for you guys. We've got a technology for teaching people the skills they need to get a better life. So let's use it. Thank you.